Y'all, every now and then, Wizard101 comes out with an update that makes possible gear setups that are borderline unbelievable, and the level 180 Darkmoor update in Test Realm is one of those updates. Today, I wanted to do a showcase of one of many crazy new builds that are now possible for the first time. Now, big shout out to Travis for literally putting together this setup in Test Realm, but the topic of the day, the new 400% death damage setup. This is looking easily to be the new best draining setup in the game, and what is really worth noting right off the bat, Travis, the person that put all of this together, is a storm, and that is very intentional. The reason a lot of this is possible is because of the massive overhaul that Wiz has done for damage in PvE and also off-school stats. Now, before going into all the implications of a setup like this, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, how are stats like this even possible? So let's go right into what Travis is doing to make all of this happen. The first and maybe even the most important part of this entire setup is that he's running full sword pins, and he's running new sword pins that are audited in Test Realm. And basically the way these work is they're manufactured in a way where you can do 90% of the damage you expect to do with your primary school with a secondary school. So Storm, right? It's a very high damage school. It has a lot of damage per pip. Obviously, at their max damage and with their very high damage per pip, you can expect to do a ton of damage. So in order for their off-school damage to catch up, what basically the devs have done is they've added sword pins that give tons of extra off-school damage. Travis is running 6 sword pins on his gear. These are all basically craftable in the Darkmoor update. And with those sword pins alone, he's already hitting very close to 300 damage to death on his storm. He's also running a double damage pet. Keep in mind, you can actually run a pet like the one that I'm running and get even more damage, and the rest of the gear is super optimized for damage. You're looking at the Professor wand, which is probably the best way to do off-school damage, because most wands that give a ton of death damage are death school only. Professor's wand, any school can run it. If you want to like basically cosplay as another school, this is a great wand. Obviously it is from a pack, so you do have to get kind of lucky to get this. And the rest of this is what you would think. He decided to run in a theme from like basically the Novice update that does give death damage. But let's say that you're not on a school that gives you secondary damage from the Novice update. There's tons of themes that just give universal damage. But by doing this, he actually ekes out even more damage than he would have gotten. And there's just full damage jewels on absolutely everything. So you're looking at Novice gear, damage jewels, a bunch of circle jewels that have damage affixed. And basically, by combining all of this, he is getting to 407 damage. Now, keep in mind, he's also actually keeping quite a bit of resist, but let's look at me on my death. Let's say that I were to put on all of my highest damage gear. Could I come even close to 400 damage? Now, big caveat here, you can't actually affix death sword pins on a death. You can only affix sword pins for a different school. So obviously, if I'm running my hat, boots, and robe, I'm just running gear that gives me a lot of death damage, right? Even if I put together all of my damage, right? All my wand, this is the highest damage wand in the game. I'm even running literally a full damage pet that gives me extra damage for running this amount with 5 extra damage. The only thing the setup is missing is circle jewels. I haven't made damage jewels, but let's say that I had 5 circle jewels that give me 11 damage each, right? 55 extra damage. Even if I had that, I still wouldn't even crack 300 damage. And while my resist might be somewhat comparable, it isn't really that much different than what Travis is running on a storm. Essentially, with a little bit of creativity on a storm anyways, you could actually have very similar HP, very similar resist, and about 100 extra damage to death, but not on a death. Now, you might be wondering, is this gear hard to get? Are these pins hard to get at least? I mean, obviously the Novice theme, Novice ring, Professor's wand, all of that stuff, even the damage jewels from Walrus, they're actually not that hard to get. But you might be wondering, right? The big thing that's changed are the pins. Are these even hard to get? But believe it or not, they're actually quite easy to get. And the way that they work is they're badge locked, and you basically craft them by using a reagent that readily drops in Darkmoor. And in order to get the badge, you just have to do the final boss of Darkmoor 15 times. Now, TBH, 15 is more than what you have to do the other bosses for, but let's be honest, the reward is greatly honestly, it's just super worth it. Now, with the setup like this, right, the big question on everyone's mind is probably, is this gonna affect school identity, right? With the increasing prevalence of being able to cross-train spells, meaning the idea of a death-only spell, that's like barely a thing. A storm can literally learn death shadow spells, a storm can learn death lore spells, a storm can learn basically every single main storyline death spell, right? With very little limits on what you can cross-train, you can essentially argue that Storm can do more damage with death spells than a death can. And the craziest part about this, of course, is that by allowing high damage per pip schools to do 90% of the damage that they could do with their primary school, and that's how they literally justified all the numbers on these sword pins. The same logic applies in reverse as well. So for example, if I'm a low damage per pip school trying to go into a higher damage per pip school like Death into Storm, my sword pins, even if I were to affix 6 of them, I'm only getting basically 60 extra damage. So it's 60 damage from pins on a death going into Storm versus about 300 damage for a Storm going into death. This idea of like cosplaying as another school, it's actually existed for a very long time, especially in PvE. And the main reason for that is because of school specific stuff actually just not affecting you. And if you guys are wondering what I mean by school specific stuff, right? Let's say that you're a Storm and you get Storm dispelled. Normally that would be a problem, right? But if you're a Storm that can hit with death better than a death can, you're not worried about a Storm dispel anymore, are you? You're just going to use a death spell and ignore the Storm dispel. That same logic can be used for anything that, you know, is school specific as well, right? Set shields, things that do school specific weaknesses, right? A big example would be like spells like Wraith or Scarecrow in advanced combat, where they're used a lot more, right? For basically giving up things or like, you know, countering your opponent, you basically get weaknesses that are based on the school of your opponent. So what a lot of people were doing to like not be affected by these is they were a school, but they basically only hit with another school. This was very common with life because you could keep your healing and your health, but you could also hit pretty hard with another school and just ignore all kinds of things like set shields, like dispels, like chromatic weaknesses like the Wraith and Scarecrow one. This problem, instead of being a low DPP school doing it with higher DPP schools, it's just going to be the opposite now. I think it's going to have some pretty serious implications in terms of game balancing. I will say this, I think the real question becomes, are you able to still justify the fact that you chose a certain school at the beginning of the game and it feels different? Right, at the end of the day, in PvE, I think that's the name of the game, right? If I chose Death, is that going to feel different by the end of the game compared to if I chose Storm and I'm running Death? I would say increasingly that is not becoming the case. However, I will say this, there is one big caveat. If you are a Death, you could always weave into another school, and that does come with a lot of extra utilities, right? For example, right, because I've chosen Fire to weave into, not only can I literally use overtimes in PvP with very good damage per pip and pierce, I also have a fusion that lets me hit through shield. Now, while that is a very good argument that your school choice does matter, because only Death can Pyre Dragon, right? Right, you could argue that, but how much of an argument can you make for your choice mattering in PvE, right? A lot of these fusions, they don't really matter in PvE. A lot of the extra stuff that you can do in advanced content by dual schooling, it's very complicated. It kind of doesn't really have any compatibility with what most people do, which is just blatant AoE in PvE. So I think if I were a dev, I would definitely listen to feedback in one of two ways. Either one, don't make it so that you can do 90% of your primary damage. As cool as it looks to see 400 death damage, I think they could scale it back. Or another solution is make it so that the fusions that you learn and, like, you know, the other spells that you learn for weaving into another school, they should matter a little bit more in PvE. I would really like to see every single school have access to fusion AoEs that do unique stuff that are relevant in PvE. Things like hit and aura, maybe. Things like hit and trap aura, hit and blades, hit and bubble, right? AoEs that do buffs, like basically accelerate. I would love to see an option for every school weaving into any other school. And as long as you keep those secondary effects a little bit unique, at least you can say, oh, I chose death. I have a unique spell that only death can use. Otherwise, I think what you will see is like a casual phase out of what is really some of the best hitting stats on some schools. You'll see that phase out to just storm running dueling into everything, right? Things like raids, things like any sort of advanced content, it'll all boil down to you need a storm that's running a bunch of other stuff. Definitely a cool update in terms of what is now possible that wasn't before. I definitely wanted to do a showcase of what I thought is easily the best off-school damage setup, because drains literally heal you. But I think stuff that's that powerful also comes with its fair share of, like, you know, people being concerned about how good it is. So I would love to hear y'all's thoughts. Do y'all think that setup is just cool and nothing else? Because I could totally see it. Or do you think it's unbalanced? And if it is unbalanced, how do you think that Wiz could respond to make your school choice matter a little bit more with all of these new things that they're adding? Hopefully I explained the way off-school DPP works and just showed what I would argue is one of the coolest new things that are available. I will be making more videos on other setups, things that are only available on other schools. Don't worry, y'all. Storm isn't the only school that got massive upgrades this update, so turn on noties for those. Drop a like if you enjoyed, y'all. Leave a sub if you're new, and as always, if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome. See y'all soon, and yeah.